She kept her head down at Cedar Creek Medical, the kind of nurse who arrived at 6:56 a.m. and left at 7:13 p.m., never a minute late, never a minute early. The ICU at Cedar Creek existed in a permanent twilight, fluorescent lights humming their metallic song, machines beeping their coded warnings, the smell of antiseptic so thick it coated the back of her throat after the first shift. Laura Bennett moved through those corridors like someone learning to be invisible, scrubs the color of storm water, badge clipped at an angle that kept her face half hidden from the main hallway. Room 312 had a 68-year-old male, construction accident, blast wound to the anterior abdomen. The chart said the explosion happened 42 minutes before arrival. Laura stood at the bedside for exactly 4 seconds, observing the wound depth, the tissue discoloration pattern, the way the body had gone rigid with internal bleeding. She didn't touch anything. She didn't need to. In those 4 seconds her eyes tracked the entrance wound, assessed the blast radius, estimated the shrapnel trajectory, and calculated blood loss at 1,800 milliliters, maybe 2,000. The way her fingers moved across the 4 setup, not hesitant, not learning, the way she checked the medication concentrations against the blast injury protocol, not the standard trauma protocol. The way her breathing stayed even as the monitor's rhythm deteriorated from controlled crisis into controlled chaos. Dr. Pierce watched her from the nurse's station. He stood there with his coffee, always in the same titanium tumbler that probably cost more than a junior resident's monthly rent, and something about the way she assessed that patient made his jaw tighten. It wasn't natural. The efficiency was wrong. The precision was wrong. She didn't move like a civilian nurse moving through her second decade at the same hospital. She moved like someone muscle memory never forgot, like her hands knew exactly where they needed to go before her brain gave permission. The angle of her shoulders. The way she never wasted motion. The military corners on her patient charts that everyone else at Cedar Creek had given up maintaining in the digital age. Laura had been at Cedar Creek for 8 months. 8 months of double shifts in the ICU, 8 months of staying late to chart, 8 months of eating lunch alone in the break room while other nurses gathered their containers and disappeared the moment she walked through the door. She understood the pattern. New person arrives. New person gets tested. New person either breaks or leaves. Laura wasn't planning to leave, but she also had no intention of breaking. Breaking would draw attention. Attention was something Captain Laura Bennett had spent the last 4 years learning to avoid at all costs. The break room had a refrigerator that never got cleaned and a coffee maker that groaned like it was dying. Laura's lunch sat on the 3rd shelf, a plastic container with yesterday's salmon and green beans. She reached for it, and the room went immediately quiet. 2 nurses near the window table looked at each other. The resident sitting at the far end stood and left, his sandwich still half eaten. Laura closed the refrigerator. She didn't look at anyone. She had trained herself not to look at anyone when this happened, when the social rejection arrived in its small, constant doses. It wasn't cruelty exactly. It was something colder. It was the kind of dismissal that came from some unspoken knowledge that she didn't belong here, that something about her registered as foreign, wrong, other. She turned to leave the break room and found Dr. Pierce in the doorway. Bennett. He wasn't asking her name. He was using it like a challenge. I need you to pull the supply logs for the last 6 weeks. Laura set her lunch container on the counter. The digital ones or the physical inventory sheets? Both. He was watching her, the way a person watches something they're trying to categorize, a thing that doesn't fit the expected shape. We're doing an audit. Hospital administration wants to verify our ordering procedures. She had already noticed the discrepancies. 3 weeks ago, the supply room had recorded a delivery of 2,400 units of 14-gauge for catheters. The digital log showed 1,800. Last week, the morphine count came up short by 40 milliliters. The saline bags went through 2 units a shift normally. In the last 19 days, they'd gone through 4. Laura had started keeping her own count, written in a small spiral notebook in her locker. She'd learned that lesson a long time ago: keep your own records, verify against the official ones, and understand exactly when the story stopped matching the truth. I can have those pulled by end of shift, she said. Pierce didn't move from the doorway. You've been asking about inventory. Trying to understand the system. The system works fine. Has worked fine for 5 years. His eyes were the color of old ice, the kind that forms in parking lots and never quite melts. You're new. You're learning. So here's what you need to know. We don't ask questions about how supplies get managed. That's administration. We take care of patients. You understand? Laura met his gaze for exactly long enough to show she'd heard him, then looked away. Deference. Compliance. The mask that had kept her alive for 8 months. Understood, doctor. He left. She waited until his footsteps disappeared down the corridor, then picked up her lunch and walked to the stairwell instead of the break room. Eating alone in a concrete stairwell wasn't ideal, but it was better than being invisible in a crowded room. Room 347 was admission number 4 for the night shift. The chart came through at 2:14 a.m., 34-year-old male, Corporal Danny Reeves, admitted from Savannah General where he'd arrived by ambulance 40 minutes prior. The reason for admission was blast injury sustained in an explosion at a construction site. The injuries were bilateral leg trauma, compound fractures of both femurs, significant soft tissue damage. Laura read the chart and felt something in her chest shift into a frequency she hadn't let herself feel in 4 years. He was lying in the hospital bed with both legs suspended in traction, bandages wrapped around what remained of muscle and bone. His eyes were open but not present, the kind of vacant stare that came from morphine and from trauma that was bigger than consciousness could process. He was maybe 34, maybe younger. Blast injuries aged people in ways that had nothing to do with time. His chest was tattooed in dark ink, a sprawling military insignia, a name Laura almost didn't let herself read, and lower, on his left forearm, 2 words in block letters that stopped her breathing. Bennett 2019. She didn't react. She had trained herself so thoroughly in not reacting that her hands remained steady as she checked the fall line, as she verified the morphine pump settings, as she looked at the vital signs on the monitor without letting anything show on her face. Her chest was performing an operation that had nothing to do with respiratory function. Her pulse was doing mathematics that probably qualified as arrhythmia. But her hands were steady. Her voice was level when she said, "Corporal Reeves, I'm Laura, your night nurse. Can you hear me?" He turned his head. His eyes didn't quite focus, but they pointed in her direction. "Bennett," he said, and the word came out broken, like he was pulling it from very far away. "I know Bennett." Bennett was, the morphine pulled him back under. His eyes drifted closed. Laura finished her assessment. She changed the dressing on his right leg, observed the tissue response, verified the surgical closure integrity. The blast had caught him at the joint line on both knees, which meant whoever had operated at Savannah General had made a judgment call about salvageable tissue that made sense given the injuries. She'd seen worse. She'd performed worse. She'd sat in the passenger seat of a Humvee in Helmand Province while her spotter, Martinez, bled out through a wound that no amount of clinical assessment could have stopped. She reset the monitor alarms and was leaving room 347 when she realized Drive Pierce was standing at the nurse's station, watching her again. "How's he doing?" Pierce asked, but he wasn't actually asking about Corporal Reeves. He was asking something else entirely, something written in the way his eyes tracked her, in the specific quality of suspicion that told her he'd already started assembling facts into a picture she couldn't control. Stable vitals. Pain management acceptable. "He's resting," Laura said. She used the tone she'd perfected, the one that existed somewhere between competence and invisibility. Not too smart. Not too aware. Just a nurse. Just someone doing the job. Pierce nodded slowly. "You handled that assessment like you've done it before." "Done what, doctor?" "Blast injuries." He stepped closer. "Most ICU nurses need help with the blast protocols. You went through it like you had a checklist in your head. I've been in the ICU for 8 years. Before Cedar Creek. It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the entire truth. You see enough of them, you get the pattern. He studied her like she was a problem he needed to solve. Well, keep your patterns to yourself, Bennett. Follow protocol. Don't go improvising with my patients. Of course, doctor. She turned back to the medication cart and heard his footsteps retreat. Her hands were shaking. She gripped the edge of the cart until it stopped. In room 347, Corporal Reeves slept under morphine and trauma, his left forearm exposed, his own name tattooed there in someone else's handwriting, a moment from a world that was supposed to be dead and buried. Laura reached up and touched the small hard object in the breast pocket of her scrubs, underneath the fabric where no one could see it. The folded flag, old and worn, the edges soft from being touched by hands that still, after all these years, didn't know how to let it go. She had thought she was safe here. She had thought Cedar Creek Medical was the kind of place where nobody looked too closely, where a qualified nurse with a clean record and steady hands could just exist, could just do the work and disappear into the shift patterns and the fluorescent lights and the beeping of machines that nobody really listened to anymore. She had thought she was invisible. But invisibility only worked if nobody was actually looking. Dr. Pierce stood in room 412 with his arms crossed, his voice rising like a siren in the sterile afternoon light. Laura's hands moved across Corporal Reeves's fresh surgical site, her technique exact: prep, inspect, cleanse, measure, apply, each motion calibrated the way she'd been trained a decade ago in field hospitals where mistakes killed people. The elderly couple in the corner chairs watched with the worried intensity of parents who didn't understand medicine but understood tone, and Dr. Pierce's tone was a knife. Nurse Bennett seems confused about fundamental procedures, he said, loud enough for the hallway to hear. Did you even pass your boards, or did they just need warm bodies? His eyes were cold, searching for a crack in her composure the way a predator searches for a limping animal in a herd. The mother's hand found the father's arm. Laura didn't break rhythm. Her voice came out flat, mechanical, the way a nurse corrects a resident who's never lost a patient on a tile floor in a place where the nearest blood bank was a helicopter ride away. The technique is correct, doctor. He smiled then, not the smile of a man who'd won an argument, but the smile of a man who'd found something he could use. He turned to leave, his expensive shoes clicking against the floor with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. That confidence was his weakness, though he didn't know it yet. By 1400 hours, the discipline notice appeared on the public board in the hallway outside the nurse's station. It was printed on hospital letterhead: official and damning, disciplinary action, insubordination and resistance to physician guidance. Laura's name centered at the top like a scarlet letter. Her jaw clenched once. That was all. She could feel the shift in the air before she even opened the break room door at lunch. 5 nurses sat around the small table with their sandwiches and salads, their conversation stopping mid-word like someone had turned off a switch. One of them, Sarah, who'd borrowed Laura's stethoscope just 2 days ago, looked up, then looked at her sandwich. No eye contact. No hey, how's your shift going? Just the sound of a chair scraping back and 5 people gathering their lunches with the careful precision of people avoiding a fire. Not worth a drama, one of them muttered as they filed past. The door swung shut with a hydraulic hiss. Laura sat alone at the table where steam rose from the coffee maker and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in a cage. She didn't eat. Her hands were steady on the table's edge, but her eyes tracked the closed door the way a hawk tracks movement in tall grass. Isolation was a weapon. She'd been trained to survive it, in Bagram, in Black Ops extractions where your call sign was the only name you could answer to, where trust meant death. But knowing you could survive something and wanting to were different countries entirely. Dr. Pierce found her at the medication cart at 1545 hours, when the shift was heavy and loud and nobody had time to pay attention to corners. His voice rose like heat radiating from asphalt. Your attitude problem is going to cost someone their life, nurse. His words were shaped for an audience even though they were alone, each syllable designed to carry down the hallway. You think you're special? You're barely adequate. You're barely here. He stepped closer, his cologne, something expensive and aggressive, filling the space between them. You don't belong in this hospital. You don't belong anywhere near patients who need real care. Laura's hands didn't shake. They rested on the medication cart the way a sniper rests a rifle on a bipod, steady, patient, lethal in their stillness. Her eyes met his, and there was nothing in them. No tears. No anger. No fear. Just the flat, cold stare of someone who'd already calculated 17 different ways to end this conversation and chosen the one that cost the least. When he finally paused to breathe, when he'd said everything his anger and his arrogance had stocked in his magazine, she spoke. Her voice was soft. It didn't carry. It didn't need to. The only problem here is that you're scared I'll notice what you're stealing. The silence that followed lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then she turned and walked away, her shoes making no sound on the tile, leaving him standing at the medication cart with his mouth open and his face the color of old blood. He pulled his phone from his pocket with shaking hands, scrolling through his contacts until he found what he needed: medical supply, Anderson. His thumbs moved across the screen, typing a message that would cost someone everything. By the time the sun dropped below the Savannah tree line, Dr. Pierce had already made his calls. He'd already spoken to administration about her dangerous incompetence, already flagged her file, already restructured the schedule so Laura would work nights only, rotating through the graveyard shift where she'd have no allies, no oversight, no witnesses. He'd also restricted her access to the electronic medical record for any patient outside her assigned unit, a technical lock that required his password to override. It was the move of a man playing chess 3 moves ahead, trying to corner the queen before she even realized the board had shifted. Laura stood in the locker room at 2,130 hours, changing into her scrubs for the night shift that would start in 30 minutes. The fluorescent lights reflected off her face like a mirror showing her something she wasn't ready to see. Her locker held nothing personal except one thing, a small, folded flag, edges worn from 18 years of being carried in pockets and held at 0300 hours when sleep wouldn't come. The flag was faded, the fold lines deep as scars. Martinez. Her spotter. Her friend. The one who never made it home. She closed her locker, clicked it shut, and turned toward the door that would lead her into the night shift, into the place where nobody would be watching, where nobody would be checking her work, where anything could happen and nobody with authority would care. She didn't know that by 0230 hours, Corporal Danny Reeves would stop breathing the way a man stops breathing when his lung collapses and the air pressure inside his chest builds like a bomb with no place to go. She didn't know that in 30 seconds, her entire carefully constructed invisibility would shatter. But that wasn't the worst part. The bus stop on Drayton Street smelled like wet asphalt and diesel exhaust, the kind of smell that made your chest feel smaller. Rain hammered down in sheets thick enough to blur the storefronts behind her, and Laura stood motionless with a cardboard box balanced on her hip, her navy scrub soaked through to the skin. She'd taken nothing from the locker except what mattered. The cracked hospital gift shop mug, the one with the peeling lighthouse logo, sat in the bottom of the box next to 3 pens that didn't work and a succulent so wilted it looked like something that had given up on living weeks ago. But it was the flag that weighed most. She'd folded it herself in the locker, standing in front of the mirror with her hands moving like they belonged to someone else, like muscle memory had taken over when her brain couldn't process what her hands were doing. The flag was small, regulation size, the kind folded into a triangle and presented at military funerals, and it was wrapped in 3 layers of tissue paper that was starting to yellow at the edges. She unfolded the corner now, just enough to see the corner of his name. Martinez. Staff Sergeant James Martinez, Bagram Airfield, Cuna Province, March 14th. The citation was stitched into the fabric in silver thread, words she'd read so many times she could say them in her sleep, for extraordinary valor in combat operations. The bus pulled up, its hydraulics hissing like a wounded animal, and she didn't move. 2 days. That's how long she'd been gone. 48 hours since Pierce's security escorts had walked her to her car at 5:19 in the morning, her badge deactivated, her access codes wiped from every system in Cedar Creek Medical. The termination letter had arrived on her phone at 3:22 p.m. on the second day, a Wednesday, which seemed important for reasons she couldn't articulate. Termination for gross violation of scope of practice. Immediate. No severance. No 2 weeks. No opportunity to appeal. The letter was from Dr. Marcus Pierce, medical director, and it was signed electronically, which meant he didn't even have to look at her name when he destroyed her. She knew what he was doing. He thought he'd erased her. He thought nobody would care that the trauma nurse they'd been calling competent 5 weeks ago was gone. He thought she was just another employee who'd pushed too hard, asked too many questions about missing supplies, and gotten in the way of his carefully constructed empire of kickbacks and falsified orders. He had no idea who he'd just fired. The problem was that Laura Bennett, the real Laura Bennett, the one with a service file so classified that officially she'd ceased to exist in March of last year, had learned long ago how to be invisible. The Pentagon colonel who debriefed her in a windowless room at Walter Reed had made that very clear. Captain Bennett is dead. Your service record has been reclassified under executive order. You have no name, no rank, no standing. You were never at Bagram. That mission never happened. 18 months of her life, erased. For Marines under her command, 3 of them buried in Arlington with ceremonies only their families attended. One of them, the one lying next to her in that compound on the eastern edge of Kuna province, never made it home at all. She looked at the flag again. The tissue paper was damp now, the rain finding its way in like it had found its way into everything else. The citation was barely visible, just enough letters showing to prove he'd existed. Existed. Past tense. Like the word choice mattered. Like past tense made it easier to breathe. The bus driver was looking at her through the open doors. He had the expression of someone who'd learned not to ask questions about people standing in rainstorms holding cardboard boxes. Laura stepped up, her wet scrub shoes leaving dark prints on the rubber step, and sat in the back row where nobody would want to sit because the seats smelled like stale coffee and surrender. The bus pulled away from Drayton Street and merged into traffic, and she watched the hospital recede in the rear window like it was moving backward into memory. Cedar Creek Medical had a red brick face and 12 floors of windows, and somewhere in there, 4th floor, northeast corner, Corporal Danny Reeves was lying in room 347, probably staring at the ceiling and wondering why his new nurse never came back. His legs were still shattered. The plate in his femur was still holding back infection by maybe 48 hours. The phantom pain was probably still waking him at 2 a.m. screaming like something wild was trapped under his skin. And she wasn't there anymore. She thought about the moment she'd decompressed his chest, the needle going in at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the textbook location where the textbook said it would work. The hiss of air escaping. His oxygen saturation climbing from 68 to 88 to stable. His eyes locking on hers for exactly 3 seconds before Pierce arrived and saw her holding the needle and smiled like a man who'd just been handed a gift that wrapped itself. Practicing beyond scope. Those were the words he'd used. Those were the words that had ended her career in a civilian hospital, just like the words in that Pentagon briefing room had ended her career as a soldier. Both times, the truth didn't matter. Both times, all that mattered was what someone with power decided to say about her. The rain smelled like copper now, which meant it was mixing with something in the air, car exhaust, rust from old bridge railings, the particular chemistry of a city that didn't know it was harboring ghosts. Laura pressed her forehead against the window and let the cold glass shock her skin into something like focus. The bus passed the downtown core, past the historic squares with their Spanish moss hanging like funeral shrouds from the oak trees, past the places where tourists took pictures of pretty things and tourists never thought about the invisible people moving between those beautiful scenes, carrying burdens too heavy to photograph. What would happen if she just kept riding? The bus route probably looped, down to Forsyth Park, probably, and back up through the historic district. She could ride it in circles until her money ran out or until the driver asked her to leave. She could become one of those people nobody really saw. She could disappear in a way that didn't require a Pentagon colonel or an executive order. She could just step out of the frame voluntarily and see if anything changed. The cardboard box felt heavier than it should. The flag inside it felt like it was made of concrete. She'd held 3 wounded Marines through 400 meters of open ground while Martinez provided overwatch from the compound roof. 48 seconds that lasted like minutes. 3 men alive because of what her hands had done. 3 men alive because Martinez had seen the muzzle flash from 200 meters away and adjusted his breathing and fired before the round left the barrel of that rifle. 1 burst. 4 rounds. The sniper went down and never got up again. Then Martinez died. Not a hero's death, not the way the citation pretended. Just a round through the back of his skull while he was reloading because there were 3 more shooters and they didn't all fall at once. Just bad timing and luck and the way combat math actually worked when you weren't reading about it in a command post. She'd carried him out along with the 3 wounded because that's what you did. That's what the mission briefing had never covered because nobody in the command post had actually been walking through that fire. The bus driver caught her eye in the mirror and she saw something shift there, recognition, maybe, or just the weight of someone else's private disaster registering as a blip in his afternoon. He didn't say anything. People usually didn't. Her phone buzzed. She ignored it the first time. It buzzed again. Then again. 3 texts coming in rapid succession like something urgent had decided to interrupt the process of her disappearing. She pulled the phone out, wet fingers leaving smears on the screen, and read the notification that appeared. Cedar Creek Medical Administration. Background check alert. Security clearance verification required. Pentagon liaison has requested immediate contact. Authorization code Charlie 905. Respond within 2 hours. She read it twice. Then once more. The phone felt like it was burning in her hand. The bus turned left onto Victory Drive and the city sprawled out before her, palm trees and river smell and the Georgia landscape that didn't give a damn about classified files or black ops extractions or nurses standing in rain with cardboard boxes and flags their government said never existed. Something in her chest was pulling tight, like a knot being tied around her ribs from the inside. What happened next didn't just change everything. It changed the kind of everything that changed forever. The monitors sang their electric lullaby at 0230 hours, steady beeps, the mechanical whoosh of the ventilator keeping Corporal Reeves breathing in room 347. Laura moved through the dimmed ICU like someone who had spent 1,000 nights in darker places. Her shoes made no sound on the tile. The graveyard shift was always quiet, just the hum of machines and the occasional nurse call light, but this silence was different. This silence had weight. She was checking Reeves's vitals when she noticed it. The respiratory pattern shifting. His chest rise becoming shallow, desperate, like he was working too hard to pull air that wouldn't come. She glanced at the monitor. Oxygen saturation dropping. 94, 91. 88. Her hand moved to his chest without thinking, palpating the rib cage where the trauma surgeon had missed something during the initial assessment, a fracture line barely visible on the CT scan, the kind that didn't show up until the patient decompensated in the middle of the night when the attending was home sleeping and the on-call resident was 3 floors down. The breath sounds on the right side were gone. Completely absent. She'd heard this sound before, in Bagram, in a supply depot hit by an IED, in the chest of a 19-year-old from Mechanicsville who'd taken shrapnel through the ribs. Tension pneumothorax. Air accumulating in the pleural space, collapsing the lung, compressing the heart. For minutes until cardiac arrest. Maybe 5 if he was lucky. Laura reached for the call light, then stopped. The on-call physician was Dr. Soto, an internal medicine resident in his first year, who'd spent the last 2 hours documenting patient charts in the call room. He would need 4 minutes just to get here. Reeves had 4 minutes. She couldn't wait. She moved instead. The crash cart was 8 feet away. Her hands were already moving, opening the sterile field, grabbing the 14-gauge angiocath needle with the smooth precision of muscle memory that had nothing to do with her nursing license and everything to do with 18 months of field training that officially didn't exist. She didn't think. Thinking was for people with time. She positioned the needle at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the exact anatomical landmark she could find in the dark, in the rain, while bleeding from 3 gunshot wounds. She pushed the needle through skin and muscle and pleural membrane. The hiss of air escaping filled the room like a held breath finally released. A sound like a tire deflating, like pressure equalizing, like survival. The oxygen saturation meter responded in seconds. 88, 92, 95, 98. Reeves's body relaxed into the bed, his chest expanding properly now, the desperate gasping finally easing. Sinus rhythm on the monitor. Heart rate dropping from the panic high of 128 down to a sustainable 82. His eyes fluttered open, confused, oxygen-starved brain slowly realizing it was receiving oxygen again. The moment lasted exactly 40 seconds. Then the room erupted. Laura. A voice from the doorway. Dr. Pierce's voice. Cold as antiseptic. She didn't turn around immediately. Instead, she secured the needle with tactical tape, ensuring the emergency decompression would hold, her hands moving with absolute certainty while her mind registered every detail of what was about to happen. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm. Reeves's oxygen saturation held steady at 99. She'd done this correctly. She'd saved his life. And she was about to lose her job. She turned to face him. Pierce stood in the doorway wearing his regular clothes beneath his white coat, his hair gelled back, his expression arranged into something that looked almost sympathetic but carried the weight of a predator who'd finally caught its prey. He stared at the needle, at Reeves's stabilizing vital signs, at Laura's gloved hands, and smiled without warmth. You performed a needle decompression. Not a question. A statement. An accusation. Tension pneumothorax. Laura's voice was level. Collapsed right lung. Missed fracture on the initial CT. That procedure is outside your scope of practice. He said it loudly enough for the night shift nurses now gathering in the hallway to hear. You're a nurse. Not a physician. Not a trauma surgeon. A nurse performing emergency thoracic procedures without physician authorization is practicing medicine without a license. He was going into cardiac arrest. Her eyes met his. I had less than 4 minutes. You should have called me. The certainty in his voice was absolute. He moved into the room, positioning himself between Laura and Reeves like she'd been about to do something wrong. You should have called the on-call physician. You should have followed protocol. Instead, you took it upon yourself to perform an invasive procedure that could have injured this patient, that could have caused pneumomediastinum, tension in the mediastinal space, complete circulatory collapse. You could have killed him. The words hung in the air like chlorine. Around the doorway, the night shift nurses exchanged glances. One of them, Jenkins, who worked the med-surg floor, already had her phone out, already recording. Not to preserve what Laura had done. To capture what Pierce was about to do. The procedure was indicated and necessary, Laura said quietly. His vitals are stable. His oxygen is. Your job is to monitor and report. Not to intervene. Pierce's voice dropped, which made it somehow worse than yelling. I'm calling hospital administration right now. I'm documenting this as a serious breach of protocol, a direct violation of your nursing license, and a threat to patient safety. Security will be here in 5 minutes. You'll be escorted from the building. And we'll be discussing whether this incident warrants a report to the State Nursing Board. He pulled his phone from his pocket with the casual cruelty of someone who had already won. He'd been waiting for this. The supply room discrepancies, the inventory questions, the way she looked at him with those flat, assessing eyes, he'd been waiting for her to make a mistake. She hadn't made a mistake. She'd saved a life. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that she'd given him a reason to remove her, and he would use that reason to bury her. Laura pulled off her gloves. The latex snapped against her wrists like gunfire in the quiet room. She looked at Reeves, whose eyes were still half closed, whose oxygen saturation was still climbing, who had 7, maybe 8 more years of life because of the 4 minutes she'd spent doing exactly what needed to be done. She looked back at Pierce. I need some Jell-O, she said flatly. For after the shift. I'm going to need something cold. The comment landed like a thrown knife. Pierce's face flushed red. One of the nurses in the hallway made a sound, not quite a laugh, something quickly swallowed. Jenkins's phone was still recording. Laura removed her badge, set it on the counter beside the crash cart with the gentleness of someone placing flowers on a grave, and walked toward the doorway. Pierce moved to block her path. "I'm not finished." She stopped. The room had gone silent. The ventilator, the monitors, the hum of the fluorescent lights, all of it seemed very far away. She looked up at him, and for just a moment, the mask dropped. Not dramatically. Not with rage or fear or any of the reactions that might have made him feel justified. Instead, her eyes held something far more dangerous: clarity. The absolute, unshakable clarity of someone who had made life-and-death decisions under fire, who had carried wounded Marines through 400 meters of enemy assault, who understood with perfect precision exactly who she was and exactly who he wasn't. "Yes, you are," she said softly. She walked past him. The night shift nurses parted like water. Behind her, Pierce was already on the phone, his voice rising, demanding to speak with the hospital administrator on call. By the time Laura reached the break room to retrieve her belongings, security had already been dispatched. By the time she'd changed out of her scrubs in the locker room, they were waiting at the employee exit. The guard was apologetic. He knew her, had worked hundreds of shifts around her, had never heard her raise her voice at another staff member. But protocol was protocol. "I'm sorry, Laura," he said as she approached with her cardboard box balanced on one hip. "I'm just doing my job." She didn't respond. Some silences were meant to teach more than words ever could. The box contained the things that mattered: the wilting succulent from a gift basket someone had sent, a battered stainless steel cup from a 2016 hospital fundraiser, a photo of Martinez in her dress blues, both of them standing in front of the Bagram flight line with their arms around each other, both of them smiling like they didn't know that one of them would be coming home folded inside a flag. The box also contained a folded flag, pressed flat against the bottom, hidden beneath the other items where no one would think to look. Martinez's flag. The one she'd carried for 18 years, from deployment to deployment, from Helmand to Loga to classified locations that didn't exist on any map. She'd never told anyone it was there. Not her discharge officer, not the Veterans Affairs counselor, not the civilian therapist who'd helped her build a new identity as a trauma nurse instead of a combat captain. Dawn was still an hour away. The parking lot was empty except for the graveyard shift vehicles and the security SUVs. She walked toward the bus stop 3 blocks away, the same stop she'd visited 2 days ago when Pierce first wrote her up, the same street corner where she'd stood in the rain thinking about disappearing completely. The sky was still dark, still heavy with Georgia humidity, still carrying the weight of 0230 hours, that hour that separated the living from the dying, the saved from the lost. Behind her, Cedar Creek Medical stood lit up against the darkness, Reeves's oxygen saturation holding steady at 100%, his lungs fully expanded, his heart beating with the regular percussion of second chances. Pierce was probably in an office somewhere, leaving voicemails for the board members he'd already called, building his case, documenting his version of events where protocol mattered more than outcomes, where hierarchy mattered more than lives. Laura didn't look back. She'd learned a long time ago that looking back was a luxury for people with something to lose. The background check was routine. Cedar Creek Medical's administrative office ran them every time someone left: payroll closure, benefits verification, standard exit protocol. The clerk in HR didn't think twice when she entered Laura Bennett's employee ID into the system at 7:19 a.m. The database pinged back instantly. A flag appeared on her screen in red text: classified security clearance, Pentagon verification required. She'd never seen that flag before. In 15 years of processing terminations, she'd never seen it. Her supervisor called the hospital's legal department. The legal department called the Pentagon. By 8:32 a.m., federal forensic accountants were being briefed on Cedar Creek Medical's medical supply contracts. By 9:15 a.m., they were in Savannah. By 10:33 a.m., they were seizing 18 months of purchase orders signed by Dr. Marcus Pierce. The thing about federal investigations is they don't announce themselves. They don't knock politely. They arrive with warrants and blank faces and the kind of authority that makes hospital administrators' voices go thin. The accountants moved through Cedar Creek Medical Supply wing like auditors examining a crime scene, which was exactly what they were doing. They photographed invoices. They photographed requisition forms. They photographed delivery receipts. They documented every single purchase order that Dr. Marcus Pierce had personally authorized, orders that bore his signature, his approval stamp, his unmistakable initials scrawled in blue ink across the bottom of forms submitted to Anderson Medical Supply. Pierce was in his office seeing patients when the FBI arrived. A federal agent stood in his doorway while he was examining a diabetic foot ulcer. The patient watched the man in the dark suit introduce himself, watched Pierce's face drain of color like someone had pulled a plug. The agent handed him a folder without speaking. Inside were glossy photographs of his signatures on documents he'd written. Pierce's hands began to shake, not with fear, but with the trembling of a man watching his carefully constructed world detonate. $47,000 for ventilator tubing that was never received. $63,000 for dialysis filters that appeared on inventory reports but never on hospital shelves. $28,000 for surgical instruments that didn't exist. $180,000 across 18 months, funneled into Anderson Medical Supply's accounts, with kickback payments routed back to a personal investment account Pierce had opened in his brother-in-law's name in Jacksonville. The math was simple. The evidence was overwhelming. The signature analysis was definitive. The timestamps on his emails requesting falsified invoices were preserved in company servers that federal technicians had already downloaded. Pierce's attorney called him at 2:13 p.m. that same day and used the word inevitable. The Georgia Medical Board convened an emergency hearing 3 days later. Pierce sat in a conference room across from 7 physicians he'd worked with for 13 years, including 2 he'd referred to his kickback scheme who were now cooperating with federal prosecutors in exchange for immunity agreements. The board chairman, a cardiologist named Holloway with salt and pepper hair and a voice like winter frost, read the evidence aloud. Forged inventory reports. Falsified delivery documents. Tax evasion across 47 separate transactions. The chairman didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His tone was the sound of professional execution. Pierce tried to argue that the termination of a nurse, that woman, that dangerous woman, had triggered the investigation, that she must have planted evidence, that she'd accessed files she shouldn't have, that she'd somehow falsified his signatures on documents he didn't remember signing. The board chairman looked at him over his reading glasses and cited a simple fact: the medical supply fraud began 11 months before Laura Bennett was hired at Cedar Creek Medical. Pierce had been stealing from the hospital since the day she arrived on the night shift. His actions had nothing to do with her. She was just the person who'd finally made him nervous enough to file a complaint that triggered the background check. She was just the person who'd noticed. The board voted to strip his medical license permanently. No appeal period. No provisional reinstatement. No 6-month suspension with mandatory ethics training. Just a line drawn through his name in the Georgia Medical Board registry, effective immediately. The vote was unanimous. 7-0. His wife filed for divorce that evening. Reporters arrived at their home in Ardsley Park with cameras and questions. Their teenage daughter was photographed walking to a friend's car while journalists called out no comment before she could speak. Pierce's social media filled with messages from hospital colleagues, former patients, and strangers, references to his fraud, speculation about how many patients he'd harmed, discussion of exactly how long a federal prison sentence might last for medical fraud and embezzlement. The hospital issued a statement: Cedar Creek Medical discovered irregularities in medical supply procurement and reported them immediately to federal authorities. We have zero tolerance for fraud. Our commitment to patient safety and institutional integrity remains absolute. Job applications Pierce submitted to other hospitals were rejected within 4 hours of his first submission. His name was radioactive now. No hospital system in the Southeast would touch him. His attorney advised him to cooperate with federal prosecutors and accept a plea agreement, which he did, on a Tuesday in October, in a federal courthouse with nothing in the gallery but his lawyer and 2 assistant U.S. attorneys. he pleaded guilty to wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, conspiracy to commit mail fraud, and tax evasion. The sentencing recommendation was 37 months in federal prison followed by 5 years of probation. 3 months after his license was stripped, Pierce stood in a strip mall classroom at Coastal Georgia Community College, wearing khaki pants and a polo shirt with a college logo on the chest. The room smelled like carpet cleaner and the particular mustiness of a building that had once housed an office supply store. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with the relentless indifference of institutional lighting. 23 students sat at desk chairs, most of them scrolling their phones, a few actually paying attention. Pierce was teaching CPR fundamentals for $14 per hour, standing in front of a plastic torso mounted on a cart, demonstrating chest compressions to people who had to take the class to renew their certifications. His hands moved mechanically through the motions. 1, 2, 3, 4. The dummy's chest rose and fell with the regularity of death and resurrection, over and over, forever. A student in the third row glanced up from her phone and watched him. She'd seen his mugshot on the news 6 months ago. The doctor who'd stolen from his hospital. The fraud case that had made the local news for 3 weeks. She recognized him, and she didn't say anything, but her expression shifted from boredom to something colder. She nudged the student next to her and whispered something. By the end of the hour, the entire classroom knew who was teaching them CPR, and nobody met his eyes. But that wasn't the worst part. On the morning of the federal audit's conclusion, when the final forensic accountant handed a sealed report to the hospital CEO, something else happened at Cedar Creek Medical. The background check that had started everything, the routine flag on a nurse's classified security clearance, had triggered a secondary protocol. Pentagon verification wasn't just confirming that Laura Bennett existed. It was confirming who she was. What she'd done. Where she'd served. The clearance that had gotten her hired under a civilian name was being activated, revalidated, restored to full status by the highest levels of military bureaucracy. The system that had required her to disappear was now pulling her back out of the dark. And nobody at Cedar Creek Medical except Dr. Holloway in Human Resources had any idea what was about to happen to their parking lot at 7 o'clock in the morning. The sound started first, a low mechanical thunder, the distinctive rhythm of motorcycle engines rolling in unison. The first bike arrived at 6:52 a.m. Then another. Then 10 more. Then 50. By 7 o'clock, the parking lot was filled with 200 Marines in formation, every engine silent now, every rider sitting at attention with their hands folded across their handlebars. The rotor wash of an MH-6 Little Bird helicopter moving into position over the emergency entrance rattled the windows. A general stepped out of a black sedan, dress blue sharp enough to cut 5 rows of ribbons covering his chest. Behind him was a gunnery sergeant carrying a shadow box. Behind them both was a woman in navy dress blues, holding a folded flag against her chest, and the Marines stood as one. Laura Bennett had come home. Hit that like button if you appreciate the nurses and healthcare workers in your life. Drop a comment if you've ever worked in medicine or know someone who has. Subscribe and let's see what happens next.